The 81st morning began the way the others had begun, with the small ritual she had made into a weapon. She carried the tray along the cold corridor, set it on the side table beneath the tall library window, and warmed the pot before she filled it. She measured the leaves against the inside of her wrist, the way her mother had taught her in a kitchen that no longer belonged to anyone she loved. She poured, and she counted, not the seconds, and not the spoonfuls. She counted the days that remained, until the man at the desk learned who she was. He did not look up. He never looked up at this hour. Calvert, the Duke of Bracewater, sat with the estate ledgers open before him, and a pen gone dry in his hand, and he let her place the cup at his right elbow without a word, as though she were a draught from a window, or the sound of the fire settling. That was what she required of him, that he should not see her. She had come into his house as a woman with no history worth the asking, and the blankness in his eyes each morning was the safest roof she had ever stood beneath. She withdrew 3 steps and waited, because the household expected her to wait, and she used the waiting to read the room. The second ledger from the left had been moved. Yesterday its spine had faced the window. This morning it faced the door. Someone had opened it in the night and set it down without care for how it had lain. She fixed the fact in her mind the way she fixed everything, now quietly, completely, without expression, and she carried it out of the room with her when he dismissed her with the smallest motion of 2 fingers. In the corridor she let herself breathe. The breath came shallow and high in her throat, and she pressed her raw knuckles to the cold plaster until the hammering behind her ribs went still. 81 days. She had given herself 100. She had counted them out on the journey north, in the back of a carrier's cart, with her whole life folded into a single trunk, and she had promised a figure to herself like a vow taken at an altar she no longer trusted. 100 mornings to find the proof, and the 81st had just handed her the first crack of light. You may think a woman who pours tea cannot bring down a duke's house. She had thought so too, once in the months when grief had made her stupid. She knew better now. A year before that morning, Marielle Sotherby had not been a servant. She had been the only daughter of a Hampshire gentleman of modest acres and immodest faith in other men, and she had kept her father's book since she was 15, because his eyes had failed and his pride had not. She knew the look of an honest column and the look of a lie dressed up to pass for one. She knew the weight of a guinea, and the smell of good ink, and the particular silence of a man signing something he has not read. Her father had taught her arithmetic as another man might teach a son to ride, and then he had ignored every warning her arithmetic gave him, because the man who ruined him wore good boots and spoke softly and called himself a friend of the family. His name was Gostry. He had come to her father with a scheme for draining the low meadows and a loan to pay for it, and a sheaf of papers that Marielle had asked to read and had not been permitted to read because her father had laughed and said a daughter's worry was a sweet thing, but not a thing a gentleman acted upon. By the time she saw the papers, they were 18 months old, and they said her father owed £4,000 against land worth half that, on terms no honest house in the country would have written. The meadows were never drained. The money was never spent on Southwood at all. It had gone somewhere into some other ledger, under some other name, and her father had gone into the ground in November, with the shame of it still on him, believing to the last that he alone had been the fool. Marielle did not believe it. She had sat in the cold parlor after the burial with the loan papers spread on the table, and she had read them 3 times, and on the 3rd reading, her grief had turned into something colder and more useful. The hand that had written the figures was not the hand that had written the terms. 2 men had made that document. One of them had meant it to ruin a gentleman who trusted easily, and Marielle had decided, with the lamp guttering and the frost climbing the window, that she would learn the second man's name and lay it open in front of everyone whose good opinion he had bought. That was the whole of her fortune now, a purpose, a trunk, and the knowledge that Gostry had not vanished after he buried her father in debt. He had risen. A man who steals from the small and the trusting does not stop while there is any one larger left to rob, and Gostry had found himself a larger trust than any in Hampshire. He had made himself steward and man of business to the Duke of Bracewater, 4 counties north, in a great grey house above a village called Calbourne, where no one had ever heard the name Sotherby, and no one would think to connect a quiet new chambermaid with a dead Hampshire squire. She had spent the last of her father's silver on the journey, and on a plain stuff gown, and on a forged character from a Bristol agency that asked few questions of women willing to work far from home for low wages. She had walked up the Bracewater Drive, in the rain with her references in her bodice and her heart in her mouth, and Mrs. Welbeck, the housekeeper, had looked her over, once head to heel, and said she had the hands of a woman who had known better days, and the eyes of a woman who would not steal the spoons, and that the first was no business of hers, and the second was the only thing that mattered. She had been put to the linens and then to the morning trays, and within a fortnight, because she was deft and silent and never spilled, she had been given the Duke's own, which was how a woman who meant to destroy the household of Bracewater came to spend her first hour of every day 3 feet from the man who paid Gostry's wages, pouring his tea, learning his rooms, and counting. The Duke was not what she had expected, and she resented him for it. She had built him in her mind as a fat, indolent lord who let his steward rob the county while he hunted, and the real man was lean and grave and worked harder than any servant in the house. He rose before the maids. He rode the tenancies himself in weather that kept other gentlemen indoors. He had buried a wife 3 years gone, and a younger brother before that, and the village said he had not laughed since, and the village for once did not exaggerate. He spoke to Marielle perhaps 4 times a week, and always in the same flat, courteous, exhausted register, and never once as though she were a person whose answer he wished to hear. "Come closer. With the tray. Mind the fire. That will do." To the household below stairs, she was nobody worth the trouble of a name. The footman called her the quiet one. The cook called her you there. Mrs. called her. Welbeck called her Sotherby, which was the false half of her true name and the only honesty she had carried into that house. And one of the upper servants, a sharp-faced lady's maid attached to the dowager, had looked at Marielle's careful hands and her too correct speech, and decided aloud, in the servants' hall, that the new girl gave herself airs. "A gentlewoman fallen on hard times," the maid said, with a curl of the lip, "and we all know what brings a gentlewoman so low." She did not say what she imagined had brought her low. She did not need to. The other servants laughed, and Marielle kept her eyes on her plate, and let them believe whatever cost her the least. She told herself the Duke was nothing to her purpose except a roof and a vantage. She told herself this firmly and often, which is the surest sign a thing is becoming untrue. The household ran on the dowager's clock and the dowager's law. Petronella, dowager, Duchess of Bracewater, had ruled the great house since before her son was breeched, and had not ceded an inch of it to the wife who came and died, nor to the grief that followed. She came down each afternoon in grey silk and 3 rows of pearls, and arranged the world to her liking from a chair by the long room fire. She had decided the autumn Marielle arrived, that her son had mourned long enough, and that the cure for a widowed duke was a new and suitable duchess, and she had selected the medicine herself. Lady Aurelie Charlecote, who was 24 and golden, and the daughter of an old friend, and who arrived in November with her mother and a great deal of luggage, and the settled expectation of a woman who has never been refused anything she truly wanted. Marielle watched it the way she watched everything, from the edge of rooms, with a tray in her hands. She watched the dowager seat Lady Aurelie at the Duke's right hand at dinner, and watched the Duke be courteous and absent, and watched Lady Aurelie mistake his courtesy for encouragement. She felt nothing about it that she would admit to. It was, if anything, useful. A house arranging a wedding is a house looking the other way, and a steward whose master is distracted by his mother's schemes is a steward grown careless. She needed Gostry, careless. So she poured the Duke's tea, and she let the dowager's plans go forward, and she told herself the cold weight in her chest at the sight of Lady Aurelie's hand on the Duke's sleeve was nothing more than the cold of the house. What she needed, and did not yet have, was the proof. the loan papers in her trunk proved her father had been robbed. They did not prove who had robbed him, because the second hand on the document was unsigned. She needed to set Gostry's own hand beside that second hand, and show the world they were the same man. And Gostry's hand was everywhere, in the Bracewater accounts, in the rent rolls, and the tradesmen's books, and the long ledgers in the library that the Duke pored over, each morning without ever quite seeming to add them up. The moved ledger had told her where to look. She did not act on it for 4 days. She had learned patience in the cold parlor at Southwood. She had learned that the woman who reaches too soon for the thing she wants is the woman who is caught reaching. She watched instead. She watched Gostry come and go from the library, a heavy, comfortable man with soft hands and a low, confiding murmur, and a way of standing too near whoever he spoke to, as though good fellowship were a kind of pressure he could apply. She watched him bow to the Dowager and flatter Lady Orley, and clap the footmen on the shoulder, and she watched the way his eyes went flat and quick whenever the Duke asked him a question about a figure. She knew that flatness. She had seen it across her father's table. On the 5th day, when the household had ridden out to a neighbor's and the library stood empty in the gray afternoon, she carried a duster and a purpose into the room and opened the second ledger from the left. It was a record of the estate's loans and mortgages, and it was beautiful work, and it was false. She saw it within a page. The hand was careful, and the columns were clean, and the totals agreed with themselves, and that was precisely the trouble, because real accounts do not agree so smoothly. Real accounts have the small, honest scars of a thing that actually happened. This ledger had been written all at once by a man copying out a story, and the story it told was that the Bracewater estate had borrowed heavily against its northern farms to pay for improvements Mariel had ridden past, and knew did not exist. The same drained meadows, the same vanished money, the same soft handwriting in the margins where a friend had recommended a sound investment to a trusting man. She stood with the ledger open in her 2 raw hands and understood that she had found a great deal more than her father's killer. She had found a man in the middle of doing to a duke exactly what he had done to a Hampshire squire, and doing it slower and larger and with more patience, because a duke's ruin must be cooked, low, and long. Gostry had not stopped at Southwood. He had only moved to a richer kitchen. It was at that precise moment, with the false ledger open and her pulse loud in her ears, that the library door opened, and the Duke of Bracewater walked in out of the rain. She had not heard the horses. She would berate herself for that later, in the dark, more than for anything else. He stood in the doorway with rain on his shoulders and his gloves in one hand, and he looked at her, the quiet chambermaid standing at his accounts with the ledger open and no duster in sight, and for the first time in 85 mornings the blankness went out of his eyes and something sharp and cold came into them instead. "You can read," he said. It was not a question. She might have lied. A better trained servant would have stammered and bobbed and let the book fall and fled. Mariel, who had been raised a gentleman's daughter, and had spent her grief learning to be still, did the thing that undid her whole careful plan, and could not, in the end, regret it. She set the ledger down squarely, faced him, and said, in the clear, correct voice she had spent 3 months suppressing, "Yes, Your Grace, and so I think, can you—" Which is why I would ask you to look at page 40 and tell me whether you remember borrowing £900 to drain the Calbourne water meadows in the spring before last. For a long moment the only sound was the rain and the fire. The Duke crossed the room. He did not raise his voice, and he did not call for anyone. He came to the desk and turned the ledger toward the light and looked at page 40. And Mariel watched his grave, tired face and saw the exact instant the figures stopped being figures and became a wound. He knew those meadows. He had ridden them 100 times. He knew, as she knew, that no man had put a spade to them in living memory. "Who are you?" he said quietly. She told him. Not all of it, not yet, but the shape of it. That her name was not only Sotheby, that her father had been ruined and buried by a loan written in 2 hands, that she had come north, not to steal his spoons, but to find the second hand, and that she had found it, That afternoon, in his own library, copying out his own ruin one clean false column at a time. She watched him through every word, braced for the bell, for the magistrate, for the cold rest of her life. He did not ring. He stood with his knuckles on the desk and his head bent over the false ledger. And when at last he spoke, his voice had dropped to a register she had not heard from him before, low and even and terribly controlled. "My brother," he said, "took a loan against his expectations the year before he died, from a sound man, recommended by a friend. We never found where the money went." He looked up at her then, and the distance between the Duke and the chambermaid was simply gone, and in its place were two people who had been robbed by the same soft-handed man and had each thought themselves alone in it. That was the midpoint of everything, though neither of them had the word for it. After that afternoon they were no longer master and maid. They were conspirators, and conspiracy in a watched house is its own slow torture. They could not be seen together. A duke and a chambermaid bent over the same ledger would set every tongue in Calborn wagging, and would reach Gostry within the day, and a warned Gostry was a Gostry, who would burn every page that damned him before they could lay hand to it. So they met as the house slept, in the cold half-hour before the maids rose, when Mariel came with the tray and the fire, and the Duke was already at his desk, and the door could be shut without remark. She brought him the morning's tea, and they bent their two heads over the accounts, and they built their case in whispers, and the small daily ritual she had made into a weapon became something else, entirely, something neither of them named. He was not, she found, an easy man, but he was a true one. Where she was quick, he was thorough. Where she leapt to the answer, he insisted on the road that led there. Because he said a thing that cannot be shown step by step to a slow and hostile man is a thing that will not stand. He taught her how a great estate's moneys moved the banks and the agents and the names that money hid behind. And she taught him what her father's daughter knew, which was how to read a forged column as a forger's confession. Their hands did not touch. Their voices stayed low. And yet there were mornings when he reached across her for a paper and stopped, his arm a hand's breadth from her shoulder, and held still a moment too long before he drew back, and mornings when she felt the warmth of him beside her in the cold room and had to fix her eyes hard on the page to keep her breath even. He never spoke of it. Neither did she. The not speaking became a third presence at the desk, patient and growing. The case, as they built it, was this. Gostry had run the same engine 3 times that they could prove, and perhaps a dozen they could not. He found a trusting landowner, recommended an improvement, arranged a loan on ruinous terms through a bank in which he held a quiet interest, diverted the borrowed money into accounts under invented names, and let the victim drown in debt he believed was his own folly. Mariel's father had been one engine, the Duke's dead brother had been another, run small as a trial. And the great house of Bracewater itself was the third and largest, the slow-cooked ruin, in which Gostry had been quietly mortgaging the Duke's own farms for 2 years and pocketing the borrowed money, while the Duke, drowning in grief, signed where his trusted steward laid the papers. The proof they needed lived in 2 places. The false ledger in the library showed the lie. The truth that exposed it, the real account of where the borrowed money had gone, lived at the bank in the county town in the house of Lanthorn and Prudo, where Gostry's invented names drew on the Duke's borrowed thousands. They needed a clerk willing to copy out those accounts. And clerks who cross a man as comfortable and well-connected as Gostry do not, as a rule, live to keep their posts. They found one. His name was Tace Drummle, and he was 19 and underpaid and angry, a junior clerk at Lanthorn and Prudo, who had noticed the way clever poor young men notice that certain accounts in his ledgers were fed by the Bracewater mortgages and drawn down by men who never came in person and gave addresses that did not exist. He had said nothing, because saying something would have cost him his place, and possibly his neck. When the Duke's own letter reached him in a hand he knew, asking him quietly to make true copies of 7 accounts, the boy sat up half the night deciding whether to obey or to run. He obeyed. Mariel never learned exactly what decided him. She liked to think it was the same cold, useful anger that had carried her north. For 3 weeks, the case grew. Tace Drummle copied accounts and passed them folded small to a carrier the Duke trusted. And the carrier brought them to Calborn hidden in the lining of a hamper. And Marielle and the Duke laid them beside the false ledger in the grey mornings and watched the lie come apart in their hands. £900 borrowed to drain meadows, no spade had touched. Drawn out the same week by a Mr. Eldon of an address that was a coaching inn stable yard. 4,000 against Southwood. Drawn by a Mr. Felbright, who had never existed. It was all there. It only wanted assembling and a place to lay it down where Gostry could not snatch it back, and a moment when the whole county was watching. What they had not reckoned, because they were honest people reasoning about a dishonest one, was that Gostry had not grown rich and old in his trade by being a fool. He had felt the floor shift under him. A careful man feels these things. He noticed that the Duke, who for 3 years had signed where he was told, had twice now asked a question about a figure. He noticed that a junior clerk at Lanthorn and Prudhoe had grown nervous in his presence. And he noticed, because noticing was his whole art, that the quiet chambermaid who poured the Duke's tea was no longer quite invisible, that the Duke's eyes followed her from the room. He moved first, and he moved well. The blow fell on a grey Tuesday, and it fell on the clerk. End quote. Tace Drummle was dismissed from Lanthorn and Prudhoe without character, accused of altering the accounts he had, in fact, only copied truly, and within 2 days a constable came to his lodging with a warrant, because the bank's books, examined, showed exactly the tampering of which the boy was accused. Gostry had got to the ledgers first. He had introduced the very alterations he charged the clerk with making, turning the boy's true copies into evidence of the boy's own crime, and he had done it so neatly that an honest magistrate, looking at the bank's books, would hang Tace Drummle without a qualm. The one witness who could lay Gostry's hand beside the forged loan was now himself a forger awaiting trial, and any account he gave from a cell would be the desperate lie of a thief trying to save his neck. It did not stop there. Gostry, having silenced the clerk, turned his soft attention to the house. Within the week, a story moved through the servants' hall, planted carefully, watered daily. The quiet chambermaid, it was said, was not what she seemed. She had come with a false character. She had been seen in the master's rooms at hours no decent servant kept. A small brooch belonging to the dowager had gone missing. And where, the whisper asked, had a penniless girl with heirs above her station got the fine thing she was seen to fold into her apron? The brooch was found, of course. It was found in Marielle's box, beneath her single good shift, where she had never put it, the dowager, distended like the weather. She had been waiting, perhaps without knowing it, for a reason to be rid of the girl whose presence she had felt as a wrongness, without being able to name it. She summoned Marielle to the long room and held the brooch out on her flat palm and said, in a voice pitched to carry to the corridor where the servants listened, that she had taken a viper into her house out of charity, and been repaid as charity always was repaid by such people. A gentlewoman fallen on hard times, the dowager said, with the exact contempt the lady's maid had used months before, and we all know what such women truly are. Lady Aurelie stood at the dowager's shoulder with her pretty face composed into sorrow, and said nothing. And her silence was the loudest voice in the room. Marielle did not weep and did not plead. She stood very straight in the cold, long room, with the whole household ranged against her and the planted brooch winking in the dowager's palm, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like calm, that Gostry had beaten her. The clerk was in a cell. The proof at the bank was now evidence against the only witness who could speak to it. And she herself was about to be turned out as a thief, her word worth nothing, her 100 days spent for nothing, her father unavenged and now disgraced a second time through her. The Duke was not in the house. He had been sent for that morning to a tenancy at the far edge of the estate, on an errand Gostry had arranged, because Gostry understood that the maid's only protection was the master's eye, and had taken care to remove the eye before he struck. Marielle was given an hour to pack her trunk. She was to be gone before her Grace the Duke returned, and the story he would be told was that the chambermaid had stolen and fled, and a man does not chase a thieving servant 4 counties to ask her side. She climbed to her cold attic room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, with her trunk at her feet and her whole campaign in ashes around her. And for the length of that hour, she let herself feel the full weight of it. She had been a fool to come. She had been a worse fool. To be seen. She had risked a boy's life and her own freedom on the belief that the truth once found would defend itself. And the truth was sitting in a banker's strongbox, being slowly rewritten by the very man it accused. She thought of her father in his cold parlor, signing what he had not read, believing himself alone, and she understood at last exactly how he had felt, and the understanding was the bitterest thing she had ever swallowed. Then, because she was her father's daughter, but not in the end the same fool, she opened the trunk to pack, and her hand found the loan papers from Southwood where they had lain at the bottom under everything for 3 months, and the calm came back into her cold and sharpened. Gostry had rewritten the bank's books. He had not been able to rewrite these. The original Southwood papers, the loan in 2 hands, had been in her trunk in a Bracewater attic the whole time he was busy burning his tracks at Lanthorn and Prudhoe. He did not know they existed. He had ruined a Hampshire squire so long ago and so easily that he had never imagined the squire had a daughter who kept books, who had kept these, who had carried them north folded against the truth like a knife against a sleeve. The second hand on the Southwood loan was Gostry's hand. And Gostry's hand, plain and undeniable, also sat in the dowager's own house, in 50 letters of business, in the rent rolls, in the very false ledger in the library available to any eye that cared to set the 2 side by side. He had silenced the clerk and disgraced the maid. He had forgotten the one piece of evidence that had been out of his reach since before he ever came to Bracewater. And he had made one further error, the kind a clever man makes, precisely because he is clever and has stopped expecting to be caught. In disgracing Marielle, he had planted the dowager's brooch. To plant it, he had needed it. And the dowager, it would prove, kept a list. Marielle did not flee. She finished packing, because a packed trunk is the trunk of a woman who is given up and is therefore a trunk no one watches. Then she sat down at the small attic table with the stub of a candle, and on the back of an old laundry list, she wrote out in her clear hand exactly what she could prove, and exactly how she could prove it, the way the Duke had taught her, step by step, so that it would stand in front of a slow and hostile man. And when the house had gone quiet, she did not go down the back stairs to the carrier's cart. She went down the front to the library to wait for the Duke of Bracewater to come home. He came home at dusk, soaked and grim, having found the Farr tenancy in good order and no reason at all for his being summoned to it, and a slow suspicion already cold in his chest. He came into his library to find the chambermaid. He had been told had robbed him, and fled standing at his desk with a laundry list and a set of old loan papers and her chin up, and he stopped in the doorway exactly as he had stopped the first day, and this time he did not ask whether she could read. She told him everything, fast and clear, while the proof was still in her hands, and the household still believed her gone. The clerk framed, the bank's books rewritten, the brooch planted, the maid disgraced, the master sent away. And the one thing Gostry did not know existed. The Southwood loan in 2 hands, his own hand the second, the same hand that filled the false ledger on the Duke's own shelf. She laid the old papers beside the ledger and set the Duke's lamp between them. And she watched his grave face as he looked from the one hand to the other, and saw, as she had seen, that they were the same. "What do you mean to do?" he asked her very low. "Not flee," she said. "He has built his whole house on the certainty that the people he ruins are too small or too frightened or too disgraced to be believed. I mean to stop being any of those things in front of everyone he has ever bowed to." The Duke looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight, the cold, tired distance entirely gone from him, and something moved in his face that she had never seen there, and would spend the rest of her life learning to read. Then he said, "We will need them all in one room." The dowager kept her clock, and her law. And chief among her laws was the assembly she gave every year on the eve of the new year, when the county came to Bracewater in its silks, and the great house was lit from the gates. To the roof line and the dowager sat enthroned by the long room fire and watched the world arrange itself once more to her liking. It fell, that year, 3 days after Marielle was meant to have been turned out as a thief. The Duke let the household go on, believing she was gone. He hid her those 3 days. In the steward's own empty wing, in the one set of rooms no servant entered without Gostry's leave, and Gostry was too busy being triumphant to enter them himself. And he sent 2 quiet letters, one to a magistrate he trusted 4 counties south who had known her father, and one to a lawyer in the county town, and he sent his trusted carrier to bring Tay Strummel's true copies out of the lawyer's strong box where a second set had lain all along, because the Duke, being thorough, had never trusted one copy of anything. On the eve of the new year, the county came to Bracewater. The candles burned from the gates to the roof line. The dowager sat by the long-room fire in grey silk and 3 rows of pearls with Lady Auralie golden at her side, and Gostry moved through the bright rooms with his soft hands and his soft voice, clapping shoulders, comfortable, certain, a man whose every difficulty had been smoothed away. The Duke received his guests with his usual grave courtesy, and waited, and the waiting in him was a held breath, and only Marielle, watching from a servant's doorway in a borrowed gown the color of cream, knew it for what it was. He chose his moment when the rooms were fullest. He did not raise his voice. He had a way, she had learned, of going so quiet that a room leaned toward him to listen, and he used it now, asking the company's indulgence for a matter of business he was ashamed to have let run so long. He said he had recently been shown the Bracewater accounts by a clear and honest eye, and had found in them a debt he had never knowingly taken, and a name, repeated that he wished the company to help him understand. He read out in his level voice the loan of £900 to drain the Calbourne water meadows. He observed mildly that he had ridden those meadows that very morning, and found them as God left them. He asked the room who then had the £900. Gostry was good. She would grant him that ever after. He did not blanch, and he did not bolt. He laughed warmly, as a man laughs at an honest master's confusion over figures too dry for a gentleman's attention, and he stepped forward into the center of the room as though to rescue the Duke from his own muddle, and he said that the meadows had indeed been begun and the work suspended for sound reasons of season, all of it noted in the proper books, which he would be glad to lay before any gentleman who cared to be wearied by them. He turned the Duke's accusation into a fond joke about a great man's head for sums, and the room began gently to laugh with him. And Marielle in the doorway felt her heart drop, because he was winning. He was actually winning, with nothing but that easy warmth and the room's long habit of believing him. The Duke let him finish. Then he said, into the settling laughter, that he was glad the steward offered the proper books, because he had brought one. And he lifted from the table beside him the second ledger from the left, the false one, and beside it he laid a set of old loan papers from a Hampshire estate called Sothwood, and beside those a folded sheaf of clerk's copies from the house of Lanthorn and Prudhoe, and he asked the room, still mildly, whether any gentleman present knew a hand when he saw it. The lawyer from the county town stepped forward to swear the copies true. The magistrate from the south stepped forward and said, in a voice gone strange, that he had known a Hampshire gentleman named Sotheby, a good, honest man, ruined by a loan he could not account for, and that he would very much like to know whose hand had written the second half of these papers. And then Marielle Sotheby walked out of the servant's doorway in her borrowed cream gown into the center of the bright room, in front of the dowager and Lady Auralie and the whole staring county, and she was not a chambermaid, and not a thief, and not a viper taken in out of charity, but a gentleman's daughter, laying her father's murder open in the only court that had ever frightened the man who committed it. She set her hand on the Sothwood papers, and she named the second hand. She did not raise her voice. She had learned that from the Duke. She walked the room through it the way she had walked the Duke through it in the grey mornings, step by patient step, the loan, the vanished money, the invented names, the same engine run small against her father and large against the house of Bracewater, and at the center of every column, Denon 50 letters and rent rolls, and the false ledger on the Duke's own shelf, the same soft, careful hand, Gostry's hand. The room had stopped laughing. Gostry made his defense, because a cornered man of his kind always does, and he made it well. He said the girl was a discharged thief with a grievance, caught 3 days before with the dowager's own brooch in her box, and that he wondered the Duke would let such a creature speak in a gentleman's house, let alone be believed. It was his last good card, and he played it hard, and for a moment the room wavered toward him again, because a thief's word is no word at all, and everyone there had heard the brooch story. Then the dowager spoke. She had sat through all of it gray and rigid by the fire, and Mariel had not dared to guess which way she would fall, for the dowager loved her house, and her son, and her own rightness above all things, and might well have chosen the steward's smooth comfort over the disgrace of having been deceived under her own roof. Yet Petronella, dowager, Duchess of Bracewater, was many hard things, and was not a fool, and she had caught in Gostry's mention of her brooch a small wrong note that only she could hear. She rose. She said in the cold carrying voice that had ruled the house for 40 years that she kept a list of her jewels and the days they were worn as her mother had taught her, and that the brooch in question had been in her own jewel case. By that list, on the very morning the girl was said to have stolen it weeks before, and had gone missing only the night before the girl's box was searched. She asked into the silence who had access to her jewel case, and a reason to empty it. She looked at Gostry while she asked it. That was the moment his face came apart. Not all at once. A man, so long in command of his own surface, does not collapse like a wall. He collapses like ice over a river. A fine line first, then the give. He said the dowager was mistaken. He said the list proved nothing. He said, his soft voice rising for the first time in anyone's memory, that this was a conspiracy of a grieving duke and a scheming servant against an honest man, and he heard the shrillness come into his own voice and could not stop it. And the room heard it too. The magistrate asked, very quietly, whether he would object to the bank's true books being set beside the bank's present books in open court. And Gostry, who had an answer for everything, had no answer for that. The Duke crossed the room to where Mariel stood. He did not take her hand. Not there. Not yet. He turned to face the county that 3 days before had been told she was a thief, and he said in his level voice, the few words she would carry the rest of her life, this lady is Miss Sotheby. She has done my house a greater service than any of you. That was all. Pah! It was 12 words, and it was a name claimed, and it was delivered in the same long room where the dowager had called her a viper. And it was enough, because the room that had decided she was nobody now had to decide again. And a room shown the truth plainly, the Duke had taught her, will in the end come round to it. The county came round to it. The magistrate took Gostry in charge that night, on the bank's true books and the Sothwood papers and the dowager's list, and the boy Tace Drummle was freed within the fortnight. The alterations in the bank's ledgers proved, by the same comparison of hands, to be Gostry's own and not the clerk's. The Duke set the boy up in an honest place, with a good character written in his own hand. The borrowed thousands could not all be got back, for stolen money runs through invented names like water through sand, but Bracewater was sound at its root and survived the wound. And the small estate of Sothwood, sold off at her father's death to settle a debt that had never been real, was bought back quietly that spring, and the deed put into Mariel's own keeping, so that the thing taken from her father was taken at last from the man who took it. The dowager did not apologize, for she was not a woman who apologized. But she did a thing that cost her more. She came to Mariel in the week after, in the long room by the fire, and she looked at her a long while, and she said that she had been wrong about her, comprehensively and aloud, and that she had been wrong because she had trusted a soft voice over a quiet one, and would not make the error again. She said it was the steward she could not forgive for making a fool of her in her own house. She said nothing of Lady Aurlie, who had gone home with her mother and her luggage in the first days of January, the match unmade, having mistaken a courteous man's patience for a courtship, and learned otherwise in the worst of all rooms. The dowager had wanted a suitable duchess. She did not say, that day by the fire, what she had begun to suspect about which woman her son had been watching across the morning trays for 3 months. Even so, she had begun to suspect it, and she did not in the end stand in its way, which for the Dowager Duchess of Bracewater was a kind of blessing, as warm as she had it in her to give. The Duke spoke to Marielle in the library where it had all begun. On a morning when the snow lay clean on the Calbourne meadows that no man had ever drained, he had not let her go back to the trays. She would not have gone. He stood by the tall window with a gray light on his grave face, and told her in short, level sentences, with his eyes steady on hers, the things he had not said across 3 months of whispered accounts. That he had stopped looking up at the world the day they buried his brother, and had begun looking up again without meaning to. The morning a chambermaid set a ledger down squarely and told him to read page 40. That he had not known, until he was sent to the far tenancy and came home to find her gone, how much of his house had walked out in her packed trunk. That he did not want a suitable duchess. He wanted the woman who had counted out 100 mornings against a man who ruined the trusting, and had spent 85 of them 3 feet from a duke without once losing her nerve. He said her given name then, for the first time, as a sentence on its own. Marielle. She had not known her own name could sound like that in another voice. She had come north to count down to a man's ruin, and the counting was done, and what remained was not the empty cold she had braced for, but this. A quiet, snow-lit room, and a grave, true man saying her name as though it were the answer to a question he had carried a long time. They were married in the spring, in the small gray church at Calbourne, with the boy clerk in a new coat in the second pew, and Mrs. Welbeck weeping frankly into a good handkerchief, and the dowager rigid and pearled and, for her, content. There was no great wedding day spectacle, because neither of them had any taste left for spectacle, and the day passed quiet and warm, and was the better for it. Afterward, in the years that followed, when Marielle kept the Bracewater books herself, and kept them honest and taught their children arithmetic the way her father had taught her, she would sometimes go into the library in the cold half-hour before the house woke, and warm the pot, and pour 2 cups, and carry one to the man at the desk who now looked up the moment she came in. She had stopped counting down to anything. There was nothing left to count toward. The man who ruined her father was 4 counties south, behind a different kind of door, exposed in open court by the very small daily honesty he had been too clever to fear, and her father's land was hers, and her father's name was clean again in the county that had buried him in shame. The thing she had carried north folded against the truth like a knife was put away in a drawer, and what she carried now was lighter and warmer and harder to lose. On the first morning of that first married spring, she set the cup at his right elbow as she had set it 81 times before he knew her, and this time he caught her raw and capable hand and held it against the warm side of the pot, and neither of them said anything at all, because the ritual she had once made into a weapon had become, without either of them deciding it, the small daily proof that she had been seen, and that the seeing had remade her whole world. If Marielle's long patience stayed with you, hold it a moment before you go. The quiet ones are so often counting something. The loud ones never notice. She was, and in the end, the count came out exactly even.